The flyer of a missing dog. They can be found in any town around the world. Some offer rewards, others a phone number where a reward can be negotiated. But how many times does one come across such a missing flyer and actually wonder what the story behind the dog's disappearance may be? Perhaps it's nothing more than just a case of being lost. Or maybe the dog wandered off into a neighbor's backyard. Often, the dog is returned to its owner safe and sound. But during those devastating hours of the dog's disappearance, only the owner of the missing dog is ravaged by infinite thoughts of possible cruelty being done to their companion. For David Morales, a resident of a small mountain town in Colombia, this is his reality. His dog vanished into thin air, and he can do nothing else but wonder what happened to his missing companion. Unfortunately for David, the story behind his dog's disappearance is one of disturbing evil. I'm Agent Kai, and I've decided to make my reports for L.I.O.S in the form of a podcast. My hope is that you, dear listener, will discover the truth of this world and open your eyes to it. In the mountains of Colombia, there is a town called Montecielo, a small town with breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains, and forests filled with hiking trails that stretch for miles. But if you tried to go visit this town, you wouldn't be able to. No one in Colombia would recognize the town. Few would remember it as a name they'd heard in a dream. The reason for this is because Montecielo no longer exists. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. Montecielo first came to my attention when my handler, Cameron, assigned me to this case. According to one of our worldwide intelligencers, dogs had been disappearing from Montecielo without a trace. One of the villagers, David Morales, had expressed his concern for his dog, Viejo, to a bartender when on a trip to Antioquia. It just so happened that this bartender was one of L.I.O.S.'s undercover intelligencers. The following is what David said about his hometown and its dogs. For as far back as I can remember, Montecielo has always been a quiet town filled with loving people. My father started a hotel, Casa en las Nubes, in the hopes it would attract tourists. It never did. Over time, this hotel became the rundown building I now live in, alone. My wife, Chiara, left me for a doctor in Bogota when she decided that small-town life wasn't for her. The only thing that keeps me from losing my mind is my dog, Viejo. Viejo is a 2-year-old Fino hound I received from my father as a marriage gift. I'm always walking through town with Viejo by my side. Everyone in the town knows him. At times, he'll go play or chase other dogs that roam the town. But I've started to notice that the dogs are beginning to fade. I see less and less dogs roaming the streets. My friend's dog, Lucha, actually vanished. It's weird. James, my friend, claims Lucha just ran off. He didn't even seem worried, which makes no sense. James loves Lucha more than life itself. It's just odd, I fear that Viejo will be the only dog left in Montecielo. I hate to do it, but I'm going to have to keep him inside. Only take him out for walks, and even then, leashed. I don't know what's happening to the dogs in Montecielo. I've told several people, even the police, but no one seems to care. They're just dogs. That's what they all tell me, but they're wrong. They're more than that. They're family. Viejo is my friend, my brother. I honestly believe he's in danger, and I feel like there's nothing I can do. That was the extent of what David told our intelligencer. 2 weeks later, I was dispatched to Montecielo. My first impression of the town was that it was quaint and quiet. Not many townspeople walked the streets, and the few who did seemed odd. It was in the way they walked, slow, uneven, mindless, like they didn't know where they were or where they were going. Or perhaps they were just tired. I tried speaking to one of them, but they just looked at me with unblinking eyes and parted lips. and let them be, and made my way to Casa en las Nubes. I met David there under the legend of Dr. Geo Nostrum, a zoologist from Rutgers University studying South American dog breeds. You should be aware, dear listener, that my name is not Geo Nostrum. My real name, for anyone who is concerned, is classified. This is not my decision, but rather the decision of Patrice Landless, the director of L.I.O.S. I am only referred to as Agent Kai. Truth be told, you've probably met or seen me at a restaurant, at a bar, in an airport. Hell, we may have been neighbors, but you'll never remember who I am. You never will. I had spoken to David beforehand to inform him of my visit a couple days prior. He sounded optimistic over the phone. However, in person, it was a different story. The man looked distraught. After introducing myself, David made some coffee and told me that Viejo was gone, vanished into thin air. He didn't understand how it happened. He had locked all the doors and shut the windows. Viejo had even slept on his bed, but when he woke the next morning, the dog was gone. No sign of a struggle, nothing. And to make matters worse, he added, he felt like he was losing his mind. That morning, he went out looking for Viejo around town. When stopping by James's house to ask if he'd seen or heard something, he saw James's wife walk past the door. When he asked James if his wife was in the house, James said no and called him crazy. James's wife had been dead for over a year, and David was sure he saw her, or perhaps her ghost, walk past that door. It was this that led David to conclude that whatever was happening in the town was the result of a witch. Now, this wasn't uncommon. There were many legends of witches in Colombian towns practicing witchcraft. I'd heard of such a legend a while back. In a rural town much like Montecielo, the townspeople complained about a local woman who kept chickens to practice witchcraft and cast spells on the townspeople. It got so bad, the police were called to investigate this woman's practices. Among the townspeople was a man who claimed to be a warlock. He told the police that the accused woman was a witch that was practicing forbidding magic, and the only way to stop her was to kill her, decapitate her, and burn her body to ash. The police weren't having any of this nonsense. They ignored the man and arrested the woman. They put her into the back seat of their car and drove the 20 or so miles from the town to the police station. Once they arrived, they noticed the woman had disappeared from the back seat. They were stunned because they had never stopped from the town to the station, and they never heard a sound coming from the back. Perplexed, the police returned to the town to see if the woman had somehow pulled a David Copperfield. When they got to the townspeople claimed to have seen the woman running into the nearby forest. The police called for reinforcements and began a search throughout the woodlands. They searched for hours without any luck until the orange glow of flames caught their attention. They ran toward the fire and found the man, the one who claimed to be a warlock, standing next to the fire. When the police asked him what he was doing so deep in the forest, the man said he caught the woman, killed her, decapitated her, and burned her body in the fire. The police weren't sure if the man was telling the truth. In the morning, however, the police found human ashes in the fire. They arrested the man shortly after, but that didn't last long. The supposed warlock vanished from the police cell without a trace. After that, the townspeople never complained about witchcraft. So, needless to say, I understood why David would think witchcraft was in Montecielo, but I assured him that no such thing was taking place here, and that I would find out what was causing the disappearance of the dogs. As for seeing the ghost of James's wife, well, that could have been caused by the lack of sleep and anxiety David had been experiencing for days. But I would soon discover that I was wrong. We were both wrong. As David poured us the second cup of coffee, church bells began to chime. I found this unusual, as I hadn't seen any church in town. When I asked David about the bells, he said there was a church, only it sat at the top of the mountain. Montecielo was a small town that sat on a mountain itself. The view of the surrounding mountains the town offered was breathtaking. Green hills stretched for miles. Clouds would roll by these mountains from time to time. To an outsider, especially a hiker, this would be a sight to behold. And while a hiker might not be pleased about having to take a car to reach the town, they would be thrilled about hiking up a steep mile through the wilderness to reach the town's cathedral. Built in the late 18th century, the cathedral, which David told me was called Catedral Señora del Cielo, was constructed in the highest point of town in order to be closer to God. The cathedral was always maintained by a local priest, and the current priest in charge of the cathedral was Padre Montoya. David and I walked out onto the porch and watched as some of the townspeople appeared from the woods. Once again, I noticed the unusual gaits that some of these people displayed. This time, I had a better look at them. Some of these people were trying to maintain their balance, while others struggled to keep their eyes open. For a brief moment, I entertained the thought that these people, somehow, had been zombified. I was in the midst of this thought when David brought me back to reality. Dios mío, no puede ser, he said. David had neglected to mention that aside from the disappearing dogs, he'd also noticed that some of the townspeople had begun to act strange. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the people he once knew were different. They recognized him, held a conversation with him, but at times they would go quiet and begin to bob their heads like if they were falling asleep before him. Other times they would just run off. David didn't want to mention this detail because he didn't want to be labeled crazy. Talking about disappearing dogs was enough to make people think he'd gone mad. He didn't want to give them another reason. But at that moment, he did just that with me. David said he recognized a married couple walking, or rather, being carried by the congregation. At first sight, this couple didn't seem out of the ordinary. However, upon closer inspection, the noticeable signs of decay were visible. They had been dead for several months. David was sure of this because he had attended their funeral. He shouted at the townspeople, asking them what they were doing. The only response they gave us was, "Celebrando el milagro." While this may have been shocking and devastating to David, it didn't do much for me. Now, don't get me wrong, seeing a crowd of people carrying rotting corpses is a frightening sight, but it wasn't out of the ordinary. The Dorajans of Indonesia retrieved the corpses of their loved ones from their graves in order to spend time with them. While some cultures can see this as a sign of disrespect toward the dead, in this culture, this is a sign of respect. Now, that ritual was from a culture halfway around the world. In Colombia, digging up the dead and spending time with their corpses wasn't a customary tradition. So, in that sense, I did share the growing concern with David about what was taking place here in Montecielo. As for the corpses the crowd was carrying, well, we never saw them again. In fact, we never saw the townspeople who made up that crowd either. I spent the next several days wandering around the town and observing the locals, or rather, hoping to catch a glimpse of the locals. What I came to find was that the streets were empty for the majority of the day and night. Some townspeople would come out of their homes every now and then to buy groceries or go to work, but they were always in a rush to head back home. On the dog front, not one single dog roamed the town. No barks were heard. Overall, the town was silent, devoid of life, which was unusual, David said to me, because Montecielo was always filled with people in the streets celebrating birthdays and holidays. In fact, David's own birthday had come and gone. The two of us celebrated his birthday at a bar in Antioquia. No one from the town, not even James, wished him a happy birthday, which I can only assume compounded the sorrow David was already feeling. And on Sunday, the most important day for these townspeople, where they attended Mass and celebrated the Lord's Day in the town square, the town decided to take the day off. The reason? The church was closed for the Lord's Day. This was unprecedented. I suppose Padre Montoya must have been having a deep and powerful conversation with God that lasted throughout the day, but must have ended in the evening, for David and I heard the tolling of the church bells a little after midnight. It seemed the townspeople had a midnight mass and forgot to give us the memo. My several days were beginning to add up to a week, and I still had no leads on why the dogs of the town had disappeared, nor why the townspeople were acting so strange. My daily request to meet with Padre Montoya was denied over and over again. Either he was the busiest priest in all of South America, or he was hiding something and knew that I knew. I investigated every inch of the town minus the cathedral and its graveyard. Whatever was going on in this town, I knew had to be coming from there. I mean, it was obvious. But what exactly was going on? Frustrated, I decided it was time to start taking the initiative. I had taken the back seat for too long here. My hopes that something would be revealed were gone. I told David I was going to start knocking on the townspeople's doors and get them to talk. With all the strange activity, the absence of people during the day, the faint, eerie wailing after midnight, the mysterious midnight masses, it was now or never. Of course, David was opposed to this idea. He didn't want to upset anyone, but it was too late for that. I was the one who was upset. The events that took place next will always haunt me. David and I went to James' house. We knocked 3 times and waited for an answer. Nothing. We waited a few more minutes. Good thing we did. James met us at the door. He looked exhausted. No, that would have been putting it mildly. James looked like a man who was in the throes of death. It wasn't a bed he needed, but rather a coffin. David and I invited ourselves in and spoke to James for some time. When asked why he looked like death, he said he'd been working hard, that's all. But when I pressed him to tell the truth, that's when she walked in. Melody. I'll admit, I was taken aback by Melody's beauty. She had long, raven black hair, a flawless porcelain complexion, warm brown eyes, and had a voluptuous figure to boot. While I was admiring her beauty, David was shaking in fear. Dios mío, un fantasma. David was right. There was no doubt about it. James' wife, Melody, was a phantom, a walking corpse. David had shown me pictures of Melody when they were kids. He also showed me pictures of her corpse during her funeral. Melody had caught a stray bullet during a gang rivalry in Antioquia a year ago. But the Melody before us didn't look like a corpse. James, who was alive, did. Standing there, I couldn't help but think that David may have been right when he said witchcraft was in Montecielo. With Melody in the room examining us, I asked James how it was possible for his dead wife to be alive. He refused to speak. Therefore, in a calm tone, I asked him again. This time, James turned away from me. Cameron, my handler, had taught me, through various and horrendous means, interrogation tactics. I didn't want to use them, God knows this is the truth. But I didn't have time to play games, and by the looks of James' condition, he was deteriorating quickly. I turned and looked at Melody. She peered at me with those big brown eyes of hers. I spoke to her and said, "What are you?" When she didn't respond, I repeated myself, only this time in Spanish. "Usted qué es?" Once again, nothing. She only looked at me with an intrigued expression. I then turned to David and winked. Finally, I turned to James and said, "This isn't your wife. This is an abomination, a thing of evil that needs to be put down like a rabid dog." I made a motion like I was reaching for my pocket. "Here, allow me to dispose of this damn soulless ghoul." James jumped and lunged toward me, but David grabbed hold of him. When he saw he couldn't break David's grasp, he dropped to his knees and begged me not to kill her, that Padre Montoya told him she could only be brought back to life once. And that was it. That was all I needed to hear. I told James I wouldn't kill her. I then told David that it was time to go pay Padre Montoya a visit. As we made our way out, David bumped into a coffee table and knocked over a bowl of marbles. They rolled across the living room. Melody, upon seeing the rolling marbles, chased after them with the glee of a child. We began our mile hike up the mountain to reach the cathedral. The surrounding woodlands were beautiful. The singing of birds and chatter of insects was invigorating. The fresh scent of the trees and plants, that was pleasant. As we made our way up the rocky terrain, David told me stories of when James, Melody, and himself would play in the woods when they were kids, and how, as an adult, he, David, would hike these trails almost daily with Viejo. Once we cleared the forest, we came upon the cathedral. The structure that stood here atop the mountain itself was a breathtaking sight. Designed in the Gothic style, Catedral Señora del Cielo was true to its name, with its twin spires and bell tower reaching high into the sky. In fact, you couldn't see the top of the spires or the tower because it was devoured by the low hovering clouds overhead. We entered the cathedral, despite David's hesitance and insistence that it would be disrespectful to barge into a house of God without invitation. It amazed me that David, even after witnessing a reanimated corpse, still felt as if he needed an invitation from Padre Montoya. Nevertheless, we made our way inside. The first thing we noticed was the smell, a mixture of earth and incense. Half-burned candles provided the only light to the otherwise dim cathedral. Padre Montoya was kneeled before a large image of Jesus on the cross, the centerpiece of this house of worship. As the doors slammed shut behind us, their echo reverberating throughout the hollow building, Padre Montoya stood up and turned around. He was wearing his bishop's hat and traditional robes. It gave him the appearance of an authoritative figure. I was surprised to see the man was younger than I had anticipated. He seemed to be somewhere in his late 20s to early 30s. With a generous smile, he motioned us to walk up to him. David spoke first. He offered Padre Montoya our apologies for barging in the way we did. The priest said in return, "No se preocupe, mijo. Estamos en la casa de Dios." "Padre Montoya," David said, "this is Señor Nostrum. He's a zoologist. Please, you must not tell lies in the house of God," Padre Montoya interjected. I skipped the formalities and got straight to the point. I asked Padre Montoya how he was resurrecting the dead. He stood there for a moment. I like to think he wrestled with the idea of lying to me, but doing so would make him a hypocrite and a liar before God. Therefore, he hid nothing and told us everything. Padre Montoya said that he was visited by an angel some time ago in the form of a man wearing a trench coat, a coat designed to hide his wings from the world. This gentleman, who refused to give his name because it would be impossible to pronounce in human tongue, gave Padre Montoya a talisman in the form of a book. This book contained one page with a prayer blessed by God. The gentleman told Padre Montoya that God had chosen him to perform his work, to bring the dead back to life. Before any questions could be asked, this gentleman walked out of the cathedral, spread his wings, and flew up into the sky. When I asked Padre Montoya to describe what this supposed angel looked like, he grimaced and said he couldn't remember. He wasn't lying. The man tried hard to recall any features but couldn't. Only the trench coat and wings came to mind. He smiled and said that he felt blessed to be doing God's work and bringing happiness to his flock. But when I asked him how his talisman worked, his smile vanished and he said with a serious expression that the work of God can only be understood by those he has chosen to reveal its secrets. And with that, he bid us a good day. Before leaving the cathedral grounds, I caught sight of the graveyard. Its ground was uneven. That made sense. Padre Montoya and his flock must have been busy digging up the dead to bring him back to life. However, the ground was put back together once again. I thought this was odd. During our hike back to town, I asked David if he had any shovels. When he asked me why I wanted to know, I told him we would be sneaking into the graveyard later that night. While the priest may have thought he was performing miracles, my gut told me otherwise. We waited until midnight to make sure all the townspeople were asleep or tending to their newly awakened loved ones before making our way back to the cathedral grounds and into the graveyard. There was fresh earth sprinkled everywhere. David, as usual, tried to stop me from unearthing the remade graves, telling me that what I was doing was disrespectful and wrong. I told him I agreed with him. However, if the dead were truly brought back to life, why would their grave sites be redone? In general, I wanted to know if their coffins were still in the graves, and if they were, what was in them. The question must have piqued David's curiosity because he joined me in unearthing the graves. It took us several minutes to dig out Melody's grave, but we finally struck the wooden coffin. It was closed and pried shut. We used the shovel to gain leverage of the coffin lid and break it open. The rotten stench of decay punched us in the face. David vomited while I retched. Once we tied cologne-scented bandanas around our faces, we were able to peer inside the coffin. Dios mío! It was just as I thought. In Melody's stead was the rotting corpse of Lucha, Hamas's dog. This explained everything. The disappearing dogs, Melody brought back to life, her childlike glee chasing after marbles. Padre Montoya wasn't bringing the dead back to life. He was sacrificing animals and transferring their souls into the vessels of human corpses. In other words, the Melody that was inside Hamas's home was not Melody, but rather Lucha. The spell, not prayer, that Padre Montoya was casting also had the reanimated corpses drain the soul of the loved one who brought them back in order to complete their transformation. It's how the reanimated were able to regain their living appearance. What Padre Montoya and the townspeople didn't know was that they were had by a gentleman unknown, the term used by L.I.O.S to identify a person or being of unknown threat. Grimoires, dear listener, are not uncommon in our world. These spell books can unleash devastating magic, especially by those who use them unknowingly. Yes, you heard me. Magic. It does exist. You've probably experienced some kind of magic in your life due to a grimoire. You just don't remember. And the reason you don't remember is because, if you were lucky, an agent of L.I.O.S was able to reverse its effects. You know if you were the victim of a grimoire and helped by one of our agents because you'd experienced what's commonly known as déjà vu. But sometimes, as is the case here in this report, grimoires of a darker nature can cause a deeper wound, one that cannot be reversed. I learned about this a long time ago when I was training to become a L.I.O.S agent. A L.I.O.S agent must be well versed in multiple subjects, including the occult. I told David this, minus the gentleman unknown or anything related to L.I.O.S, and told him we had to burn the grimoire Padre Montoya was given in order to break the spell. When he asked me how I knew to do this, I simply told him I read about such a thing in a book once. Before we could come up with any plan, the townspeople, or more specifically, the reanimated townspeople, had surrounded the graveyard. They no longer looked like corpses, which meant they had drained the life energy of their loved ones. Señor Nostrum, David said, are these people not people anymore? I told David they never were. They were only walking corpses with other spirits inhabiting the vessels, in this case, the spirits of the dogs. A cruel joke by the gentleman unknown. The reanimated began walking toward us. David and I hightailed it to the cathedral and did our best to barricade the doors with the shovels. It wasn't long before the reanimated began pounding on the doors. If we didn't burn the grimoire, we'd be devoured next. Luckily, Padre Montoya was inside the cathedral at that moment, grimoire in hand. He turned toward us from the altar. From the looks of it, he was once again up to his miracle work. Behind him was a half-decayed corpse lying on a table, and lying on the floor, lifeless, was Viejo. Padre Montoya scolded us for interfering with matters that did not concern us. He then went on to say that we would be punished by God. It was here that I interrupted him and explained that his prayer book was a grimoire of darkness, that it was taking the spirits of the dogs and transferring them into the corpses, and using the life force of the living to restore the flesh. Of course, he didn't believe me. I slowly made my way toward the altar, keeping a close eye on the corpse behind him that was now beginning to twitch. David followed my lead, yelling out Viejo's name, followed by calling Padre Montoya a murderer. This caused the priest to say that he wasn't a murderer, but rather a servant of God, and that sometimes a servant of God needed to perform what was necessary in order to carry out God's work. I challenged Padre Montoya to pour holy water on the book. I told him if he was doing God's work, that if the grimoire in his hands was holy, then holy water would do nothing to the book. But if it was a thing of evil, the holy water would burn it. He told me I was in no position to give him orders. The banging of the cathedral doors grew louder now. It wouldn't be long, I knew, before the reanimated breached the doors. The corpse behind the priest rose to its feet. David and I both took a step back. It was James. Melody, or rather Lucha, must have drained the poor bastard of all his life energy. Prior to this, I believe, Lucha must have somehow gotten Viejo to jump out of David's bedroom window and follow her back to the cathedral where he was kept until it was time to perform the miracle. But what bothered me about all this, aside from the obvious, was if James did what he did to his dog in order to regain his wife, that's understandable, despite its morbidity. However, what was the reason for Lucha to transform Viejo? I don't have an answer for this, dear listener. The corpse turned toward David when he called its name, Viejo. Those dead eyes that now flickered with other life recognized David. And what was surprising to me, those eyes also recognized the situation. In a grating, hoarse voice, the corpse spoke. David fell to his knees and burst into tears. I rushed to David's side and told him to instruct his dog to grab hold of Padre Montoya. It took a moment, but David acquiesced. The corpse did as his master said. Padre Montoya must have been taken by surprise when the corpse touched him because he dropped the grimoire. It was at that moment that I ran for the grimoire and snatched it from the ground. Once the book was in my hand, the reanimated breached the doors. I ran toward the center of the hall, where a small pillar containing a pool of holy water stood. I dropped the grimoire into it. Within seconds, the book erupted into a magnificent display of red and purple fireworks that lit up the dim building. The reanimated entered the cathedral as living bodies, and by the time they reached the pillar of holy water, they were lifeless corpses scattered on the floor. I turned toward Padre Montoya. The corpse that had taken hold of him had rejoined the dead. Padre Montoya hit the ground on all fours. He yelled out to God, asking for forgiveness. The next morning, David and I hiked back into town. Padre Montoya said he wanted to stay behind to bury the corpses. We offered our help, but he told us he wanted to do it alone, a sort of penance. In town, David and I found that it was no longer a place for the living. Everyone in town had joined the dead. It took us a few days to collect the bodies of the townspeople and bury them in the graveyard. After Padre Montoya gave the dead last rites, the three of us made our way out of town and into the city of Antioquia. I left David and Padre Montoya a couple days later. According to a recent update by one of our intelligencers, David settled down in Itaigui. He even found a girlfriend, although no new dogs. As for Padre Montoya, the news was grim. He returned to his cathedral and hanged himself. No note was found. Our intelligencers took charge of burying his body among his flock. Then the town of Montecielo was burned to the ground. There were no traces of the gentleman unknown. Whoever or whatever this gentleman unknown is, no thoughts can be concluded at this time. There simply wasn't enough evidence. However, it is likely that this gentleman unknown will strike again. What happened in Montecielo was deliberate. For what purpose? Well, that is the question now. As far as anyone in Colombia is concerned, lightning struck a building in Montecielo during the middle of the night and a fire broke out, burning everything to ash. The line between good and evil is a blurred one. Sometimes one thinks they're doing good when in reality they're doing evil without realizing it. Padre Montoya truly believed he was doing God's work. The man was not evil. He had good intentions. He had strong faith. However, what he didn't count on was having his faith used against him. The gentleman unknown who approached Padre Montoya took advantage of a man of faith by playing on his beliefs. It is this gentleman unknown who is the evil here. One has to wonder, however, how it's possible to truly distinguish good from evil, especially in a world where both seem to be blended into one. It is this agent's belief that one must equip knowledge from the past and use that knowledge to prevent any more evil from occurring in the future. But that may not be easily accomplished. If the philosophers of yesterday were right, then the question of evil is a complicated one. Padre Montoya must have known this. He must have known, perhaps even believed, like Irenaeus pointed out centuries ago, evil may be a necessary component for the development of the human race, which is what gave him the justification to do what he did. In his mind, sacrificing dogs to raise the dead was justified because God said it was okay. It was a necessary evil, maybe even a balance. In the end, Padre Montoya couldn't handle the evil he had committed by his own hand. He knew he had damned himself, had damned his soul. Is it true that to be blessed, one must know what it is to be damned? This is a frightening question, and it is one this agent cannot answer. While everyone involved in this report underwent some kind of damnation, not all walked away from it blessed. While this question looms in the mind, this agent is certain of one thing. Evil exists in this world, and it's getting stronger. If nothing is done to prevent it from growing, then, as agent fears, humanity will have its final sunset.